Hello and welcome. This is Richard Sachs, Provost and VPAA at University of Rio Grande and Rio Grande Community College. I'm here for Voice of Rio Grande. I'm one of four on-site hosts, and I am delighted today to have Professor of History Sam Wilson here. And he's going to talk about Civil War work he's done in the past and a Civil War project. Bob Evans Farm across the highway from us is going to open with a Civil War in Gallia County exhibit soon. And I'd like Sam to share with our audience some of the particulars about that.
Well, thanks for having me, Richard. We're really pleased with the Civil War in Gallia County for a variety of reasons. One, it involved so many people from the community. The 150 Civil War celebration, it was, let's say, including, let's say, Bob Evans Farm with Ray McGinnis and Gail Leslie, the Wayne National Forest with Ann Kramer. We had the Emancipation Committee with our own former Dean of Students, Elaine Armstrong and Bob Gordon. And of course, I was representing the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War with Jim Euler and another member of our camp who was very active, as well as John Holcomb. The Sons of Union Veterans is a fraternal organization created by an act of Congress in the 1950s. We actually replaced the Grand Army of the Republic, the actual veterans, and to be a member of the Sons, you have to have a relative who had fought in the war. So we carry on the tradition of the Civil War, and we were very, very pleased to put this exhibit together honoring the Civil War veterans who fought in Gallia County. There were 134 Gallia Countians who died in the war, so it was a very active participation in the war, including, let's say, the Jenkins raid, as well as, of course, the more famous Morgan's raid of 1863. So it's an exhibit that's free to the public, and we hope a lot of people come take a look at it and look at the artifacts. It should be well received by all visitors to the farm.
Now, most people see the Civil War as occurring mostly in the South, except for the Battle of Gettysburg. But again, you mentioned Morgan's raid in the summer of 1863 and also the Battle of Buffington Island. Can you share that with our listeners?
Well, the Buffington Island is the second battlefield to be in the North. There were two battlefields, not major battlefields. Of course, Gettysburg is, but Buffington Island is the second battle to take place in the North. There were only two, so one is Gettysburg and one is in our own Meigs County. And so it really is a significantly recognized event. In fact, it's the most reenacted event of the Civil War because it took place over such a large area where Morgan crossed the Ohio into Indiana, throughout Ohio. You can go down Highway 32 and see Morgan Raiders markers. And it does come to Gallia County briefly as Morgan turns to go to cross the Ohio River. And of course, troops from Gallipolis actually go out and meet with Morgan in the Buffington Island area, where he is turned away, of course, along with gunboats in the Ohio, and makes his way up north where he's eventually captured. So it is recognized as one of the major events in the North in the Civil War, although it's not nationally recognized. It is among reenactors, it is among Civil War, let's say, historians.
Now, Ohio is known as the birthplace of presidents, with 6 presidents. And when people study the Civil War, it's often interesting to find out that a lot of the major generals in the North were Ohioans, right?
Right. Oh, quite a few, as a matter of fact. Not only Grant, who was born not too far away from here in Point Pleasant, Ohio, but you have Sherman from Lancaster. I think Sheridan as well, if I'm not mistaken. You also have McKinley. There's a monument at Antietam where President McKinley, of course, fought. He was not an officer in the sense of, let's say, a major officer, but he fought in the war itself, so he's recognized. And I think possibly Sheridan was there. Like I say, there are quite a few, maybe I think Custer may have been born in Ohio. I'm not sure there, but right. You know, so what you have is Ohio was, and to make a modern analogy, the hockey team in Columbus, the Blue Jackets, are named after the Civil War participants.
Really? I didn't
right,
know
yeah.
that.
It was, so next to Pennsylvania and New York, more populous states, Ohio had the most volunteers in the Civil War. So to honor them, Columbus named its hockey team after the Blue Jackets.
What do you know? That's fascinating. Now, we're in southern Ohio here. Where I live in Gallipolis, I can look out my front window at the city park, the Ohio River, and West Virginia on the other side. Of course, West Virginia was Virginia until 1863. But I know studying the Hatfield-McCoy feuds, you often see that people fought on both sides, that families actually had sons, some who fought for the Confederacy, some who fought for the Union as well. And down here in Southern Ohio, people often tell me, you don't sound like you're from around here, because I'm from Cleveland. But it seems like once you get south of I-70, there's often what people elsewhere would call a Southern accent.
Right.
I know there's a Confederate flag I pass twice a day driving to and from on Route 588. Mm-hmm. So do you know stories or families? It must be heartbreaking to have brothers fighting against each other. I know Lincoln often used the house divided metaphor, right. But are there indications of that in this area?
Oh, very, very much so, as a matter of fact. And you also had the Underground Railway being so prominent here that you had escaped slaves who'd come to Gallipolis, go to Poke Patch, where it was a part of the Underground Railway stations. In fact, there were settlements still there, and they actually are preserved by the National Park Service. And you have stories, let's say, of some going to fight, let's say, for the Union cause, leaving Portsmouth, going to the Western Theater. But you have that contentiousness where some people will, let's say, go back across the river to fight for the South because they were in favor of the institution of slavery, and those that came across to fight for the preservation of the Union. And of course, we were on the front lines because the Ohio was the separation between North and South, the Mason-Dixon line. Now, eventually that will change in 1863, as you mentioned, when we joined West Virginia to the Union. But Union soldiers from the area continued to go into West Virginia, following like in 1861, following General McClellan as he established telegraph lines throughout West Virginia. So it was a very volatile area. You had the Jenkins raid. You can see Jenkins' home down Highway 2 in West Virginia on Point Pleasant. So troops from Gallia went across. The Trumbull Guards, for example, would go across. The Gallia Guards would go across and fight against, let's say, Jenkins, as well as, let's say, at Bovington. And of course, Gallipolis was a huge embarkation point for soldiers to go into the Eastern Theater. Camps were there, Camp Gallipolis. There was other camps in the county. So many troops from Gallia. There were enough troops to make a company, not a regiment. So Gallia Countyans fought in different regiments throughout the Civil War, and some in West Virginia regiments, as a matter of fact. And so they went to different theaters. But other troops were formed here who were actually not from Gallia County, but were mustered here and organized here. So it became a very centrally significant location for the Union, and you even had cannons up at the Mound Cemetery overlooking the Ohio. So traffic on the Ohio, a storage area for, let's say, supplying troops, invasion troops going into the South. So all told, Gallia County and, of course, the entire four-county area we serve played a major role in the Civil War. Although it's not, again, given the publicity, it was a significant point, let's say, in our, more or less, our struggle.
Now, you mentioned to me before you led a Civil War caravan some years ago.
Yes.
It was part of a course in Rio's Master's Graduate Program.
Yes.
Can you share with us that visit to Antietam and connecting with Ken Burns?
Oh, my pleasure. The Civil War caravan took place just as an idea because of the interest in the Civil War and the Rio's commitment to its education program to take teachers who've never been to a location to the actual location to look at, let's say, where the great battles of the Civil War took place. In this case, you really don't know a battle until you've walked it. You can read about it, let's say, moving a flank, turning over a hill, and you don't realize how geography plays such a significant role in military history. Now, bearing that in mind, we decided to take a group of students, and it was a wonderful, let's say, trip. We also allowed them to take family members. I recall one student bringing her 12-year-old son, and he eventually came here as a student, so that paid off. Right. He had a wonderful trip, and he just loved being at Rio Grande, so we appreciate that. But the trip began, let's say, to Harper's Ferry and viewed the, where John Brown, of course, had taken refuge of the arsenal there. Sure. Eventually went to Antietam, but it was the 10th anniversary of the Civil War series of Kent Burns, if you recall, and he was occupying the area of Burnside's Bridge. And as we toured the location, there were 3 essential battles that took place on that day, and it is the bloodiest day in American history. Over 26,000 casualties take place. So it's quite an emotional scene to go through the cornfield and other areas, but we were told that Ken Burns was there. And as we were at the major station there, I happened to run into him, and you could recognize him from his PBS series. And like I said, he was really gregarious, really wonderful in dealing with us. His wife was upset because she didn't like the fact that they go anywhere else in the world, he was never recognized, but as soon as they hit a battlefield, everybody knew who Ken Burns was. So it was a you know, kind of humorous aspect. But he was also very attuned to asking us questions. The late Ed Rourke of our Fine Arts Department had a copy of his book that Ken Burns graciously signed. But his question was, did you get that book here? No. And he was on his phone contacting his publishers, wanting to know why his book was not in the bookstore at Antietam. So he took a picture. It was a wonderful PR picture, you know, the Rio Grande Civil War Caravan at Antietam with Ken Burns. But he was quite willing to take our questions. We were looking at his a copy of his Civil War series in our bus as we were traveling. So it really was a wonderful event to start off our trip. And we went from Antietam to Gettysburg to Arlington to Bull Run, all the different battlefields. It was really a wonderful trip, and I think it really pushed Rio out there, and it gave a really boost to the teachers who got, because I don't know if people realize this, at a Civil War site, the National Park Service will prepare teachers' aids and give you packages to take back to your classrooms.
Wow, that's wonderful.
They will even mail aids to teachers who aren't there, which includes, let's say, videos made by 5th graders describing as newscasters the different aspects of the battle from different sides. So they will send that to schools around the area if you request it. So teachers are able to acquire a huge amount of, let's say, support information for their classrooms. So it was a wonderful trip, and I think it brought out the best of what Rio Grande is about.
That sounds great. I'll have to share with you off camera at some point my professional friendship with Bob Utley, Robert Utley, the historian of the American West, who for 3 decades was the National Park Service historian. And when I brought him to campus in Colorado, he was embarrassed that he's only master's prepared. And I said, you have nothing to apologize for.
He's paid his dues.
Yeah, his work on Crazy Horse and Custer and so many other things is extraordinary. And I thought it was great. It's one of the great things about our federal government, that not only that we have a National Park Service, but that we have a National Park Service historian of someone of the quality of a Bob Utley who does things like that.
I think Ed Beers, I think, he may still be alive. He was the one who was quite active. He's in his 90s, a very good historian.
Utley's in his 80s now. He's still alive, and when I brought him to Fort Lewis, this would have been 2007, he was mostly deaf, and he apologized about that. But and I said, just talk about anything you want, and he said the title of his presentation was "Who Owns the Place Where Custer Died?" which I thought was fascinating, and he just riffed on that. He was just wonderful. But you said a couple things just now that I think are fascinating, and I'd like to push a little further. Number one, that the single day at Antietam is the bloodiest day in American military history. For myself, as a teacher of American literature and American studies for 3 decades, I often ask my students what was the bloodiest American war, and they always say World War II. And when I push them further, they say Vietnam. And then I make the point, don't you realize in the Civil War we were fighting against each other, so all the casualties were on our side. But can you talk about that, especially since, as I've shared with you before, when I was trying to provide some direct materials for my students teaching Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage years ago, I came across a picture of a Civil War doctor's surgical outfit, and it looked like something you'd get at the hardware store. It was simply different sizes of saws to cut off limbs. And I was trying to get these students in the 1980s and 1990s to realize what it meant like to be part of a 19th century force. So can you talk about the bloodshed? And I mean, without, I'm not trying to be too patronizing about this, but I think a lot of 21st century Americans don't realize how violent it was and how dangerous it was.
When you're talking about a modern war, you're talking about Vietnam, you're not talking about the percentage of casualties. You're talking that sometimes you had 30% casualties in the Civil War. And that is a huge amount, let's say, of people injured as well as killed. A tremendous amount of bloodshed. And we are talking 50,000 people, let's say, at Gettysburg over 3 days. That is over 30% casualty. So it's difficult for people to understand it. Borodino, let's say, in 1812, Napoleon is facing, of course, the Russians under Kutuzov, and you're talking, let's say, every minute the casualties equal like a 747 like crashing. And it's difficult for human beings. What I tell students is that you can imagine, it's the Stalinistic approach that one death is a tragedy, a million are statistics. They cannot fathom 30% casualties, 26,000 people being injured. How many of them are being killed in that one day? It is just tragic. But in the case of, let's say, the medical science being basically archaic at that point in time, the bullets being used were over 50 calibers, so when it really did hit you, it removed part of your bone. There was nothing left to do but remove the limb. If you were hit in the stomach, it was fatal. And of course, we didn't have the anesthesia we have today, but in many cases, you're talking dirty barns out in the open, wiping the saw on your basic apron and going to the next person, and of course, the infection rate. Disease kills more people than bullets do in a war. And of course, reading Walt Whitman's poetry, as you will,
Sure.
of the war itself is tragic in itself. He worked in hospitals around Washington, as you well know. Yeah. Now, Crane himself wasn't in the war.
Right.
But he did.
Born in 1871. My students can't believe that. Born 6 years after the Civil War.
Right.
Yeah.
He's picturing in Red Badge of Courage, Chancellorsville, Lee's great victory there. So, but Civil War veterans were remarked to have read his work and said it's like you're absolutely there. He basically, but it's also an important book for Civil War and military history in general, because it's a book where he's portraying the common soldier, where up to that point the stories being told were from the generals and from the quote-unquote romantic heroes of the 19th and 18th centuries. And of course that segues into the Great War, where you have the great poets like Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves and Wilfred Owen, and you're getting the story from the perspective of the common soldier. And so the industrialized war that takes place, particularly from the Civil War through World War I, they're still fighting really, particularly the Civil War, Napoleonic structure of tactics, where you're marching men against cannons and musket rifles. And so in that respect, the tactics are behind the technology of the age, and as a consequence, you're going to have higher casualties.
Sure.
So the Civil War has higher casualties as a consequence of a lack of evolution of tactics, as well as, let's say, improved weaponry.
Sure.
By World War I, though, in our first battle of World War I, our artillery units will expend more shells in 3 hours than the entire Civil War, both sides, for the entire war. So technology makes it even more brutal. Right. By 1914.
Sure. Our time is almost up, but I have to ask one more question. You mentioned Burnside's Bridge, and I've heard just in folklore that our term sideburns come from Burnside. Is that true? And can you talk about that as somebody who has a wonderful mustache, which sometimes is waxed?
In most cases, that's the only probably positive thing Burnside did for the North. The idea of Burnside's Bridge is actually a misnomer in the sense of it being a positive. It's actually a negative. And Burnside, of course, was involved in the crater incident in 1864 outside of Petersburg, and he was dismissed after that. He was a rather incompetent general. But yes, the idea of sideburns do emanate, as most people of that period did have large beards. Lincoln, of course, will grow one. It was the style of that time, and of course, you look at some of these Civil War veterans, they're very, very young, but they all have beards, and so that gives them the appearance of being older than what they actually were. They were actually, many of them, quite young, leaving to fight in the Great War. Yeah. But I really do thank you and appreciate you having me on today, and hopefully we'll do it again sometime soon.
Okay, that's
always
great.
A pleasure.
That's great, Sam. Let me just tell our listening audience, Professor Sam Wilson is a full-time professor of history here. He teaches face-to-face courses, but he also teaches online courses. So around the country and around the world, you can go to rio.edu, and see if there's room in one of Professor Wilson's online courses. Sam, thanks very much. It's been my pleasure. We'll move on now, and the concluding point today is always Prevarications of the Provost. Some of the people here make fun of my vocabulary, but if you are not aware of the word prevarication, I suggest you go to the dictionary, and it's a great word and one of my favorite words. There seems to be an implicit shared belief within contemporary democratic nations that both governments and universities allot their budgets based on principles of logic and purpose, calibrated, of course, to the laws and principles of their particular nation's laws, institutional university policies, and governing boards. In state funding of public higher education in the United States in the past few years, there has been a distinct and nationwide movement towards new state funding formula models that no longer simply quantify inputs like number of students, credit hours elected, square footage of buildings to maintain, but instead that reward outcomes, things like student success, student completion, including credit hours and courses completed, certificates and degrees earned. Of course, whenever a formula, however complex and detailed, is adopted to apply to 23 community colleges from throughout the state of varying size and institutional mission, there will necessarily be congruences and dissonances in fit. In Ohio, the 2011 to 2013 biennial budget awarded 20% of state funding to degree completion. In the current 2013 to 2015 biennial budget, 50% of state funding is awarded based on degree attainment, and 25% of state funding is awarded on so-called completion milestones, currently defined as completing an associate degree, completing a long-term certificate, that is 30 credits or more. Short-term certificates of less than 30 credits may or may not be added to future biennial budgets, and any other form of certificate. In areas of both degree attainment and completion milestones, access category weights may be applied in order to acknowledge and compensate incrementally student populations that are underserved. And Ohio is concerned about these underserved populations that are traditionally underrepresented and with low academic success. Yet the success of students in those categories is critical to the state's ability to meet its post-secondary attainment needs. In fiscal year 2015, our current fiscal year, there are 3 such access categories. One is adult, that is students 25 and older at time of enrollment. One is low income, that is federal Pell Grant eligible at any time during one's college career. And the other is minority, American Indian, Hispanic, or African American. The final 25% of the state allocation is in what's called student success points. Developmental education math, that is successful completion of a DevEd math course, followed by enrollment in a college level math course. Developmental education English, that is successful completion of a DevEd English course, followed by enrollment in college level English. Earning 12, then 24, then 36 semester credit hours of college credit coursework, and a 48 credit threshold will be discussed for inclusion in the next biennium. Again, once you get to 60 credits, if you've selected correctly, you should be getting an associate's degree, 120 for a bachelor's degree. This combined and somewhat complex logarithm for funding incorporates a number of concerns that seek to incentivize student success while acknowledging the challenges that confront students and institutions in preparing Ohio citizens to be qualified and work ready for the 21st century. 3-year data averages are used in order to ensure data stability and to protect against short-term vagaries in admission and enrollments. There's a continuing expectation that the formula will continue to change as we determine what seems to be working and what still needs to be changed. I encourage all Ohio citizens, especially those in college or with family members in college, to enter into an informed discussion concerning any future changes to the state formula. Topics for possible inclusion in future state formulae include tracking job placement and workforce training for community colleges, tracking subsequent academic success and completion after transferring away from the community college, There are also supporters within Ohio state legislatures who are advocating that the formula should focus more specifically on student background rather than student enrollment status. Student background would be things like quality of the student's high school, financial status, racial and ethnic identity, rather than focusing on student enrollment status, that is part-time or full-time, enrolled in developmental ed courses. These and many other issues are yet to be determined, but I hope that we can work collaboratively as Ohioans to forge increasingly better and more equitable state funding formulae in the future that recognize institutional differences while acknowledging our shared missions with unique priorities. Thank you very much for tuning in today, and I look to see you in the future on future Rio Voice programs.